All right, today I just want to answer the basic question of, is anxiety sinful? Is it sinful to worry? Is it sinful to be a worrier? And end with sort of a little logic of why anxiety is such a big deal to God. Why is it's such important evidence as for what's going on in our hearts. This topic of anxiety, of worry, is one that we all deal with. We are all dealing with anxiety more maybe today than at least in a long time. As fast-paced as our lives are, we deal with this issue of worry and anxiety. And we have passages like Philippians 4:6, which say very plainly, do not be anxious or do not worry about anything. Frankly, that's a command, right? It's a command to not be anxious, and therefore to not follow that command is to be sinful. Do not be anxious about anything. Do not worry about anything. But in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Now, having said that, I do want to draw a line, a differentiation between sort of the way we use the word worry today and the specific context that it's using this idea of anxiety in Philippians chapter 4. Because even elsewhere in Philippians, this same Greek word that's used for anxiety here, or anxious, is used in a positive sense, that there is a good sort of anxiety. Philippians chapter 2, verse 20 and 21. Paul is talking about Timothy. He says, I have no one like him, praising him, who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. That is the same Greek word as the anxious or anxiety from Philippians 4:6. Do not be anxious. But here he is praising Timothy because he is genuinely anxious for them. He is concerned for them. There's this description of anxiety as a good thing. Similarly, 1 Corinthians 12:25, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members have the same care, the word there, same Greek word, the same anxiety for one another. That there's this good sort of anxiety that stirs us on to love and good deeds, that stirs us on to care for each other. Even synonymous with the word care, this idea of anxiety. There's a good sort of anxiety. Or 1 Corinthians 7, verse 32, where Paul's talking about singleness, and says, I want you to be free from anxieties, same Greek word. The unmarried man is anxious, same word, about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. Obviously here Paul is saying this kind of anxiety is a good thing. It's good to be anxious about how to please the Lord. It's good to have that sort of anxiety. So there's a good sort of anxiousness. For instance, there's a sense in which anxiety is what gets me out of the bed in the morning, right? What gets you out of the bed in the morning? The kids got to be fed. That's a bit of anxiety that gets me out of bed. The kids got to get to school. I got to get to work. All these things are anxieties. It's anxiety in some sense that makes you productive, right? If you didn't have any sort of anxiety, you wouldn't get anything done. The to-do list would just sit there. But since you have some anxiety about it, it stirs you on to productivity. I think those can be categorized in this positive idea of anxiety, of things that stir us on to good things. So, what is this kind of anxiety that's being commanded against? What is this kind of anxiety that's seen as sinful? Well, as always, we should look at the context around this passage in Philippians 4, as you would in any other passage. So he says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Next line, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So the first simple answer is that the sinful form of anxiety is anything contrary to the peace of God that should exist inside the Christian. That the Christian has a peace because of God in them that is contradicted by this sort of anxiety, that is in conflict with this sinful sort of anxiety. That the peace of God will guard your hearts against that sinful anxiety. They are juxtaposed against one another. So we're not talking here about appropriate concern, but a lack of peace, and really, maybe more fully, a lack of trust in God, that God will come through. It's important to realize here in Philippians, the situation that was going on, Paul has already, in this book, talked about a lot of the things that should cause people anxiety, that would cause normal people anxiety, such as his imprisonment, or the sickness and lowly bodies of the people that are reading this letter, or that he is on the brink of death and could die any moment, or the external conflict that there are those who are preaching the gospel to harm Paul outside of the church, or internal conflict with divisions inside the church between people like Euodia and Syntyche, which you mentioned earlier in chapter 4. All of these issues seem like reasons for anxiety, and it's in response to all these things that Paul says, do not be anxious, that there is no reason for anxiety if you trust that God is who God says he is, and what he has promised you is going to occur, then you don't have reason for such anxiety. The kind of anxiety in the face of these things, in fact, is the anxiety which would be sinful. That may seem crazy to say that anxiety in the face of death is in some sense sinful, but it is. This is the kind of anxiety that he's talking about. And he goes on in chapter 4. I'll break that down in a moment. But he goes down in chapter 4 to, I think, give us a good idea of working out of the opposite of anxiety. In chapter 11 through verse 11 through 13, where he says, I have learned. So he says, do not be anxious, but trust God. And he fleshes that out. Verse 11, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. The opposite of anxiety. Whatever situation, right? Paul's literally writing this in prison, literally on the brink of death, could die at any moment. And he says, in whatever situation, I have learned I am to not be anxious, but be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret to facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can endure all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can do all things. Really, the idea is of endurance. I can endure all things through Christ who strengthens me. Instead of being a person of anxiety, I'm a person of contentment, Paul says. Those things are put over and against each other. So here's the summation. The anxiety that is sinful is an anxiety that is over against trusting God. When you're anxious about your to-do list, that doesn't have anything to do with trusting God and his sovereignty. When you're anxious about getting out of bed and wanting to get things done, that's not really about God's sovereignty and trusting that God is in control of things. But when you're anxious about the things he's listed there, or already in the book of Philippians, when you're anxious about other things that are directly in dealing with trusting that God is sovereign, that he's going to handle things the way they need to be handled, then you're dealing with a sinful form of anxiety. To put it succinctly, my answer is this. Anxiety is sinful when it is evidence of a lack of trust in God and his sovereignty. If the anxiety that exists in you could be quashed, could be gotten rid of if you trusted in God more, then it's an anxiety that you should fight against. It's an anxiety that you should deal with. Because here's the basic idea. Anxiety for the Christian is illogical if you believe what you claim to believe. I've said this several times before, but it's an important thing for the Christian to understand, as anxiety is something we all battle with all the time. If you believe what Christianity teaches about who God is, if you believe that God is sovereign and not one sparrow falls from the sky out of the hand of God, that the lot is cast into the lap, but it's every decision is from the Lord. If you believe that nothing happens that God does not allow to happen, that everything that happens in the hand of God. That's what the Bible teaches. If you believe that, the Bible word for that is sovereign. If you believe God is sovereign, in control of all things, able to stop anything that he doesn't want to occur, and you believe that God is more loving than any other being in the universe, which the Bible says that he is the definition of love, and in fact loves you more than anyone ever has, then it's illogical for you to be anxious, because the one who controls what's going to happen to you the rest of today, the one who controls what's going to happen to you or what's not going to happen to you the whole day tomorrow, is the same one who loves you more than you could possibly comprehend. Where is the room for anxiety in such a life? If the person who loves you most in the world, your mom, your sibling, your husband or wife, was handed a controller and they were going to control whatever happened to you for the rest of the day today, whatever's going to happen to you, the person that loves you most was in control of that. How would you feel about that? You'd be excited to see what was going to happen the rest of the day. You'd be excited to see what this person who loved you like that had for you. That is literally the case for the Christian. It is literally the case that the one who loves you more than anything else in the whole universe, more than anyone else loves you in the whole universe, I should say, is in control of what's going to happen to you the rest of the day. And not only that, unlike your mom or your husband or your wife, is omniscient and knows exactly what you need. That is the God who's in control of what's going to happen to you the rest of the day. Where is your anxiety? Where is room for your anxiety for the rest of the day today? Where do you find a spot for you to be anxious if you trust in that God? If you believe that God is sovereign, you believe that he loves you like he claims to, there is simply no reason for logical anxiety. It doesn't make any sense. And so, when we are anxious about things like that, like the rest of the day, like the future, like death, and even like sickness, and what we are doing is saying we aren't really sure that we trust God. And that's a big deal. I think that we must be dealing with in our hearts. So if you're a person that is anxious in that sense, not just about to-do lists, though there's probably a point where that becomes this sort of anxiety, but anxious about the future, anxious about children, anxious about fill in the list of anything that you should be trusting God with, then you need to take an honest look at your heart and deal with those things and pray for God to strengthen you. Pray for God to build your faith. Pray for God to help you to trust him more. Love you, church. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds. Talk to you soon.